Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update for the 25th of July 2023. It's the first of two parts. The first one always gets restricted because I show some videos of tanks getting hit, and YouTube don't seem to like that, and they restrict that. So I've split it into two. Anyway, let's go to where we normally go, which is the general staff, Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveats apply, of course. We have some fairly significant numbers again in the kind of categories that you're used to, but also fairly high across like tanks and APVs here, armored personnel vehicles covering infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, mine resistant ambush protection vehicles. So 600 liquidated personnel. That's pretty much what we're expecting for the time at the moment. 12 tanks, 13 APVs. I think that is a fairly significant number. There's a lot of footage of vehicles being lost circulating around, loads of montages. I could sit here and spend 3 hours showing you stuff that's been blown up in the last week. 30 artillery systems and one multiple launch rocket system is another significant day for Russian losses in that category. As I keep saying, at some point, the Russian ability to defend their lines by hitting the Ukrainian troops with barrages of artillery will be seriously affected. It arguably is already. It's about getting to a point where the Ukrainians are comfortable in then doing some serious maneuvers without the fear of having massive amounts of artillery ammunition landing on their heads. Two anti-aircraft warfare systems. That is significant given that on average over the war they lose less than one a day. 14 drones, that's not from last night, night before. 12 vehicles and fuel tanks, 5 pieces of special equipment. 5 pieces of special equipment will be predominantly electronic warfare, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance equipment, although it is a wide category. So I think that's another fairly decent day for the Ukrainians. I mean, just there's a lot of equipment being lost. And we'll come on to that a little bit more in a second. Let's kind of flesh out what's going on. Positive news coming from Klishivka, Bakhmut direction, and of the main attack. The losses of the Russian enemy are astronomical. A bunch of dead Russians, wounded and captured. We'll come on in the frontline part to talk about the successes for the Ukrainian around Bakhmut, where are having they had a particularly good day yesterday. Um, the Russians are potentially losing quite a few troops around some of these areas. Not to say that the Ukrainians won't, of course, be losing their own numbers too. So Russia has stated that a huge repair facility in Novostepova was hit yesterday. This can mean they got hundreds of vehicles in one shot. This is speculation, but there was a major hit on a repair facility, I believe, in Crimea with storm shadows, and that could well have gone up, and a lot of fuel, a lot of trucks. There's talk in these sort of threads about how the Russians don't. In fact, Trentelenko talked about this, about how the Russians don't make. I think there's a term for it, but they don't make their vehicles safe before they take them to repair. So they still have munitions in. There's loads of fuel, etc., etc. And in fact, I'm going to find it because there's a really useful thing I want to show you. So bear with me a second. I've already got it in place to speak to you about in my next topic category. So yeah, that could be a serious loss of vehicles, or it might not be at a repair facility in Crimea. A Russian Ka-52 attack helicopter has been shot down today in the east on the eastern front. All the crew were lost by all accounts, and that is significant, not just because they lose an expensive airframe that's one of the most modern, certainly rotary aircraft. They are losing all the expertise with the crew as well. That is significant. Now, Oryx, the compilers of the list of visually confirmed losses for both sides. Yesterday, we had a rare day where the Ukrainians had lost a few more than the Russians, and they usually wait 2 days, but they've obviously got so much stuff to get through that they've released the next summary a day later, and both the Russians and the Ukrainians have lost 43 pieces of equipment each. Here are the Russian losses. So quite a spread of stuff. Not too many tanks there. quite a big spread of equipment otherwise. There's some and air defense systems thrown in there and counter battery radar. So that's your high value. And then quite a few trucks. And yeah, whereas Ukrainians have 43 as well, although yeah, you've got 6 ZIL 131s that could be skewing the data a little bit. Actually, no, those are trucks, so that is useful for the Ukrainians to take them out. Um, Berger Panzer ARV, armor recovery vehicle. That's going to be a pretty good hit for the Russians there. They're useful and they don't have a huge amount of them. But yeah, quite a lot, an interesting spread in that list too. So 43 of each side, but there does seem to be a disparity between the general staff figures and the Oryx data lists at the moment. And the disparity happens a lot in terms of towed artillery and self-propelled howitzers. So the Ukrainian general staff figures are on a daily basis posting numbers that there are numbers around anywhere from sort of mid-teens up to 40. Now that's happening on a daily basis, and we are seeing with Oryx that actually there's often not more than maybe 10 in one day. Then either there's just a mass of equipment that is unable to be identified, or um, there just isn't video footage of it, hasn't been released by the Ukrainian MOD, or the Ukrainian MOD or the general staff are not telling the truth, or somewhat not telling the truth. There's going to be a whole kind of spectrum of options there. My guess is that they aren't going to be releasing like 40 bits of video. They're taking out, like today was 30 artillery systems. They're probably not going to be working really hard to get 30 bits of video footage out onto social media, so people can be happy with uh, reconciling Oryx with what they are claiming. They'll put some out. Oryx will then get hold of that and identify that as best as they can and put that into the list. But not everything is going to be going out. So that's what I think, that these will be big undercounts, particularly for the Ukrainians. I can't talk for the Russian numbers and how they would be operating. And of course, there are going to be other things that skew the data. So certain bits of equipment, for example, um, aircraft that get shot down and land quite a long way behind enemy lines can't often be identified unless the Russians or partisans get hold of imagery and post that themselves. So there are certain bits of equipment that might be more likely not to be spread online, depending on where that is most often hit, so on and so forth. Anyway, moving on, Ukrainian armed forces and artillery are burning Russian electronic warfare systems. So this is, to give those who are pro-Ukrainian an idea of, the successes Ukraine are having, and also where they're aiming for. We heard the other day that I think it was Cherevati, or it might be Syrskyi, was saying that electronic warfare systems were the number one target. Here, there's footage. Triada and Lear 2 electronic warfare systems were destroyed by aerial reconnaissance men of one of the Ukrainian special forces units. This happened in the Bakhmut sector. In total, 9 enemy targets were hit by accurate fire in a short period of time. In addition to electronic warfare systems, also you got artillery pieces and enemy armored vehicles being destroyed. So yeah, there's a whole plethora of footage coming out, and perhaps for me, one option could be that a couple of guys on Oryx are just completely overwhelmed. I mean, it's not their job. They, as I said before, they're not getting paid. And in fact, Oryx was saying this, the actual Oryx person, not Jakub Janowski, was saying yesterday again, because he's giving up in October, but he was hoping that a job would come out of this. And he was complaining again that basically Western intelligences use their data. They know this 100%. They use their data, but like don't pay them for it, or they don't give them a job. But you've got like the British MOD and the US intelligence saying, "Yep, thanks, Oryx. We'll take all your data." And then when we give our intelligence updates and reports, that's the data we're using. But it's not us compiling the data; it's these guys over there. Anyway, thanks for that. rather than say, do you want a job? Because actually what you're doing is super useful. But yeah, anyway, to continue, defense forces have destroyed 6 enemy air defense systems of the Kherson region. Quote, we have worked on 6 enemy air defense systems in our area, and they are no longer able to defend these places. Tactical aircraft in our direction are detained in the zone inaccessible for our air defense, said Humenyuk. So this is, again, an indication that the Ukrainians are aiming for particular types of equipment, namely air defense, artillery, electronic warfare. Okay, and here we have GMLRS, so HIMARS or similar, hitting a Russian Buk air defense system, and that's the evidence, that there are air defense systems being hit. But of course, this is almost arbitrary selection of video footage. But Buk systems, there seem to be a number of these getting hit recently, and they cook off in fairly unique ways. These air defense systems. Right. Okay. Last couple of bits in this section. Another high-ranking officer, was killed in Ukraine. Commander of the 129th Guards Motorized Rifle Regiment, Yevgeny Vashunin, is dead. He died in battle 10 days ago. That has been announced by the Russians themselves. So that is another significant blow for the Russians. It's not to say Ukrainian higher command aren't killed. I'm sure they are. Just we don't hear about them so much if they are. Lots of rumors, of course, spread by the Russians, and then most of the time they appear to be false. For example, Budanov and Zaluzhny. Moscow, Russia. Here we've got a bit of a light show. This is at a train station. The train is on fire at the station, causing some quite significant electrical fizzing. And this will be good. Anything like this is obviously good for Ukraine because it messes up logistics inside Russia, makes people annoyed. Don't know whether it's at all connected to the war, probably not, but there is just an awful lot of that kind of stuff going on. Train stations and train logistics inside Russia are a favorite for partisans to strike. Now, talking of strikes, let's go on to longer ranged strikes from both sides here. So, Russian drones have attacked Zhytomyr Oblast. So, that's to the southwest of Kyiv, been attacked with drones. Drones, I think, were sent against Kyiv. I think all of them were shot down last night. A little bit unclear of how many drones. They haven't actually announced much. I think it might be because actually it's happened much later. It's not in the night, but maybe this morning. But anyway, there has been drone activity into Ukraine. Some infrastructure has been hit in Zhytomyr, but I think in Kyiv they were all shot down, which is not unusual. Now, going back to the strike on the ammo warehouse in Jankoy that was hit yesterday, another Storm Shadow strike. Crimean partisans report that a batch of P-800 Onyx missiles were destroyed at the ammo warehouse. And in fact, I've seen several kind of claims pertaining to this with different sort of bits of evidence. This is possibly very useful for the Ukrainians because these Onyx missiles are part of the kind of suite of munitions that have been thrown against Odessa. These can't be shot down, or at least not unless you're using something like Patriot air defense system or similar. These are anti-ship missiles that so far I think 100% of them have hit their targets, or at least have not been intercepted. Slightly more importantly, because actually I don't think they hit their targets because they end up being slightly more inaccurate due to the fact they're used to navigating over flat seas to hit ships in the middle of a flat sea. And then when you send them inland, there are lots of things to mess around with the navigation capability, and so they end up being somewhat inaccurate, but they can't be intercepted. That's the point. So if there's a bunch of these in an ammunition warehouse that have been taken out in Crimea, then that is really, really useful. Okay, so what's been happening in Crimea and elsewhere along the south? Well, there have been these claims by the Russians, and again, the last 24 hours they've done this, which the Russians claim that the Ukrainians are sending drones against Crimea, and they don't mention Storm Shadows. But what appears to be happening is that the Ukrainians are sending drones, and they send them down to Odessa and then across the sea to Crimea, so they don't get intercepted over Kherson, and that then gets the Russians to exhaust their air defense systems. This is exactly what the Russians were doing against Kyiv, which is send a load of drones and a load of missiles, overwhelm the system in these saturation attacks, and then send other things maybe afterwards, or hope that of those some get through or whatever. Here there have been claims that the Ukrainians are using drones to do that, much cheaper, overwhelm the air defense systems, and then hit with storm shadows. But that they also possibly using decoy missiles as well. We know they've used them particularly up on the eastern front. So it's time to talk about the PSU airstrike strike on the Russian Novostepova repair facility in Crimea, and how Ukrainian drones opened the door for Storm Shadows launched by Su-24s to do a huge amount of damage there. And that was analysis by Rebar talking about how the drones are being used by Ukraine. So hitting Novostepova with a Storm Shadow took advantage of the fact that the bombed up armored fighting vehicles are highly vulnerable to chain reaction explosions, and the Russians simply don't safe vehicles in the repair cycle. So that's what I was talking about earlier, for manpower reasons. So this is the potential for quite a lot of destruction to have taken place there, and quite a number of vehicles that were being repaired to go through chain reaction explosions. And an example that Trentselenko gives in Novostepova was just like Camp Doha on 11th of July 1991. On that date, there was an accident in the wrong place at Camp Doha, and it started an explosive chain reaction that disabled or destroyed 31 M1 Abrams tanks, 28 Bradley IFVs, and a single M113. Now, imagine being the guy that was responsible for that. You'd be, I think I might be court-martialed. The devastation there, and that was the US base where you've got chain reactions blowing up on all these sort of vehicles, and the argument is that this might well have been what happened in Novostepova. What made the Storm Shadow strike effective was the use of cheap Ukrainian drones to activate or soak up the VKS, so the Russian Air Force and Russian Army surface-to-air missile fire. The US had provided the ADM-160 MALD decoys. I've talked about them before for the same mission, but they are expensive, so you might as well just use cheap drones. And thus provided small there aren't too many of those provided. Ukraine's converted commercial drones with small warheads, military specifications, GPS, and inertial guidance are enough of a threat that they have to be engaged for fear of the damage they would do, slipping stealthy Storm Shadows through a very electronically noisy Ukrainian drone Russian SAM engagement was easy peasy lemon squeezy. So he then goes on. I won't go into the rest of it, but there's a discussion about the cheap, what do you call it? Small, cheap, numerous against big, big, expensive, and very few, and you get these kind of trade-offs going on. But it looks like the Ukrainians might well have hit some really high value targets recently in terms of logistics. And indeed, Reporting from Ukraine did a pretty much whole video on that last night, and some interesting graphics that they have to show that I think illustrate that they're hitting these places, a number of key locations, and each time they hit these places, because they're often very close to railway lines, they shut down the Crimea railway line, because otherwise you just stacked up. So the number of times the Crimean bridge has been closed down since the explosion on Kerch Bridge, from how many days ago that was, it seems I see messages that traffic's closed again, both rail and sort of freight. I mean, they've kind of opened one lane, but it has weight limitations. It just, things are not looking good in terms of logistics, and then this messes up everything all around. And at the same time, they are hammering. I don't know if it shows here. Yeah, they are hammering the front line with artillery, and causing all sorts of problems along the Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk front line. And this could well be why the Russians are kind of, are they panicking? No, I don't know. But they are throwing a lot into this northern sector to try and distract the Ukrainians from causing all this damage down on the southern front. And indeed, it looks like, and we'll talk about this in the next video on the frontline update. It seems like they have stabilized that northern front and are having, some success up and down the front line elsewhere. So anyway, but to do with strikes, this is all in concert with what they're doing behind the lines, and it's possibly starting to really hurt the Russians. Is my conclusion. Russian military bloggers report that today's attack on temporarily occupied Crimea was the use of 4 Storm Shadows. This is yesterday. Cruise missiles fired from a Ukrainian Su-24 bomber. 3 missiles attacked the ammunition warehouse in Vilny, Vysoloy airstrip, and 1 missile attacked the repair base of the military equipment in Novostopova. All rockets hit the target. So this is not what you hear from the Russian official line, from the MOD. They say, oh, just drones, blah, blah, blah. But actually, Storm Shadows are doing damage on Crimea. Now, concerning the Onyx missile, I mean, this is according to Ukrainian figures, and are these accurate? We just don't know. Russia's long-range missile stocks, based on Ukraine's reporting as of July the 24th, so this is yesterday. Russia is currently estimated to have 274 caliber X-101, KH-50, 555 Iskander and Kinzhal missiles in stock. So that's kind of adding them all up. But the interesting part is looking at how many of each sort they have. So Kinzhal, they have 50 of 53 remaining, is the claim here. Iskander M, 95 of 800, so they're getting really low on them, really low on caliber as well, pretty low on KH-22. These are anti-ship missiles, but it's still 92 of them. The question is always, when you look at these, what, how many are you going to need going forward? What's your base limit for strategic reserves? So you might look at it and say, well, they got loads more missiles, in terms of adding them all up. They've got hundreds of missiles, 274 of all of those added up together. Yeah, but you're like, okay, but if you use all them up and then you're attacked by Poland, what have you got left in? If there's a war with NATO, what have you got? So Russia can't just use up all their missiles on Ukraine, because they would have absolutely nothing to deal with any future military engagement. We are starting to see Onyx being used. These are anti-ship missiles, and they're obviously co-opting them to use not against ships, a bit like the KH-22. And that's, again, a sign that, A, they don't have other weapons to use, but also that those other weapons are getting shot down by what is now a very much improved air defense network across Ukraine. So it's having to use missiles, ballistic trajectory missiles, and other types of missiles that are stealthier, that can get through the air defense system, but aren't necessarily the best missiles to use otherwise, as in their circle error probable, their navigation, so on and so forth, means that they end up hitting, I don't know, cathedrals. The explosions in Donetsk yesterday, that is, I don't know, another target. I mean, Tokmak was hit again yesterday. Just a lot of other places getting hit behind the lines. Here's one in Makivka, a huge fire consuming a depot, barracks, probably with military equipment, because you can hear it cooking off in Makivka, which is a suburb of Donetsk, as reported by Russian sources. Apparently, HIMARS came and said hello. So that is a significant fire that was still burning last night. According to statements of Russian Voronka, so Russian mill bloggers, Storm Shadow missiles and Ukrainian drones are currently striking Crimea. That is now. That's 9:30. It's now coming up for 10:30. So that was an hour ago. So they are active every day, Storm Shadows. Russia claims it successfully repulsed an attack on its patrol ship, Sergei Kotov, 370 kilometers from Sevastopol. So this is doing the rounds at the moment. Right now, this has only just sort of come out again in the last hour or so. The invaders say 2 marine drones attacked the ship, but were destroyed. So that's the official line. However, Tim White then says, but why did they block all shipping lanes? Is Kotov damaged and limping back to port? So it's interesting. We've had previous examples of supposed repulsion of Ukrainian naval drones, and yet the information coming out is really kind of bizarre, and we don't hear about those ships. And is it the Ivan Kurs? I still don't know what happened with that ship. So yeah, who knows? It might have been damaged, and it might be limping back to port, or it might not have been damaged. But then why close all the shipping lanes? Right. So, moving on to other bits and pieces here, Ukraine will soon inform the Pentagon about consequences of their use of US cluster munitions, Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov tells CNN. And first of all, go and watch the Perun video on cluster munitions from 2 weeks ago. Really very good. I'm going to share the conclusion with you in my extra video later today. Or if I do an extra video, I don't know. I'm doing a live stream interview at 1 o'clock today, so pop in and watch that if you can. But yeah, cluster munitions I think are really important. That they have given the Ukrainians renewed impetus, and I think you are starting to see. Well, arguably, I'll be interested to see what you guys think, but they are starting to make some gains on the front line that they weren't making as a bit of a stasis, and now they appear to be making gains all over the front in various places, particularly the south and around Bakhmut. And there's a lot of talk about connecting those successes with cluster munitions. So they're clearing out trenches and then moving in. And it could be that cluster munitions have made a difference. And it might be that they've made a difference not just because they're cluster munitions, but because they're just munitions in general. They're suddenly getting a load more munitions that they can then just use artillery far more widely, not just the kind of munition it is. I hope they'll be more effective than conventional ammunition, says Reznikov, especially against artillery systems during counter-battery battles, as well as against armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and infantry in the fields. I mean, there are claims that you can use these. No, it's not there. One shell is basically equivalent to using 10 to 15 standard shells. So in what you can achieve in the kind of accuracy, you can send one of these shells near a towed howitzer, for example, and you're going to take it out. Whereas if you're using, unless you're using expensive Excalibur shells, if you're using conventional munitions and you're having to walk them in with drone spotting, then that might take 10 to 15 shells before you finally get there. Right. Okay. Moving on. That's a doorbell. I have to go for a second. Right. Interruptions aside. Right, I think this is worth dwelling on for a little bit. So, there are people of Odessa who haven't slept for nights and endured terrible missile attacks, yet they work hard to help their beloved city. So this is just a sort of montage of music, a montage of people working together. Now, this is great, but it's about thinking what's going on behind the scenes here, and it's about little things. What you have here is unity. What you have people here is people working towards a common goal and a common enemy. What you do if you do this, and I talked about this when I was reading excerpts of Bomber Mafia by Malcolm Gladwell, and part of what I wanted to express in reading that is that large scale bombing of cities to affect civilian populations does not break their spine, does not break their spirit, their backbone. No, instead, it actually, and we learnt this from the Blitz in London, is it brings them together, and they have the Blitz spirit, and they come together and they do stuff like this. And what's the end result? They all hate Russians more. They all hate Russia more. They all think Putin is evil. You don't break their spirit. You actually bring them together and bring them together in a collective disgust at the nation that is perpetrating these things. So it's just a massive own goal, as well as being like horrific and etc. etc. Okay, Poland intends to create a new engineering battalion on the border with Belarus. It will be equipped with Polish Baobab K mining systems capable of creating a minefield 2 kilometers long and 30 to 90 meters deep in 22 minutes. Now, this wasn't about Poland and Belarus. I want to just show you this. I mean, this is a vehicle, and we have seen one of these actually taken out, a Russian equivalent of these taken out uh, before. Showed you some footage some months ago. But it's this. When we're talking about the challenges that Ukraine have on, particularly on the southern front line, this piece of kit can create a minefield 2 kilometers long and 30 to 90 meters deep in 22 minutes. So if you have a massive supply of mines, then a piece of kit like this, imagine how many mines it can lay in a day. If it can do that much in 22 minutes, have that working a whole day, wow. And this is a challenge. And I think going forward, every army in the world is going to be thinking, yeah, we're involved in a massive war and we are in any defensive scenario where we are defending from an attacker, it's all about mines, really. So, yeah, thought I'd share that with you. The occupiers still cannot restore full traffic on the Crimean Bridge, sort of referring to stuff I mentioned earlier. This is Humenyuk saying, in particular, return of cargo transportation is very slow. Mostly, they tried to do it with the help of a ferry crossing, but this slows down the traffic many times," said Humenyuk. And as I keep saying, that they are having issues logistically right around Crimea because of that, and right around the south, and they're just closing down that bridge uh, repeatedly. It's better to avoid such structures. Budanov advised Russians not to use a Crimean bridge. Yeah, I would advise that too. Anyway, that's the end of this initial video. Please check out my. Sorry, this has been slightly longer because there's quite a lot of content. Please check out my second video coming out shortly.